welcome back to my channel. It is Nonfiction November, and the last time we met, I discussed basically the nonfiction that is still on my TBR, what remains. And the idea is to get those down to 0 and to refresh my TBR. And basically what I do is that to be able to control my TBR, when I learn about a new book, I don't always just buy it right away. Typically, I'll put it on a wish list and I keep it there, especially for books that I might not be so sure about. So I'll keep them on a wish list, and then if after a year I'm still intrigued by it, then it'll have a higher likelihood of being purchased. While if I'm like, oh, you know what, actually I don't even remember putting this on my list, it doesn't sound good anymore, since then I've heard really bad things, then I can just delete it and I don't feel like I've wasted money or my time, etc. But because of that, my wish list is actually quite large now, and I thought it would be just kind of fun to go through what kind of books I'm looking forward to refreshing my TBR pile with. So I'm reading these off my Amazon wish list in front of me on my computer, but I will post put the pictures of the book covers. Now, the first one and the most recent addition to my TBR list is the book Missoula, Rape in the Justice System in a College Town by Jon Krakauer. Now, Jon Krakauer is a author that I've read 2 books now from. I read his most famous, Into Thin Air, which is about his experience on Mount Everest during the incredible disaster that occurred at that time. And then I also I read his book where Under the Banner of Heaven, which discuss about Mormonism in the US and sort of like the radicalism and extremism and just even the creation of it in general. And that book was absolutely fascinating as well. So I have a lot of faith in Jon Krakauer. I trust his writing. I like his writing style. And I think basically any topic in his hands will be very good. So this is apparently a devastating expose of colleges and local law enforcement when it comes to campus sex crimes. So that sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'm really, really interested in reading that. Now, the next book that's on my wish list is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an Indian History of the American West. Recently, little by little, I'm starting to pick up interest in reading about the US, where it's just, where I'm from. And this past year, I read Comanche, Under the Comanche Moon, or just Comanche Moon. But I read a book about the Comanches, and then before that, I had read about the Texas Rangers. And so following that thread, reading the very, very famous Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee just seems like the natural step into my progression into this topic. So yeah, that sounds absolutely fascinating. Now, I read a lot about East Asian history. I read a lot about Japan during the war. Also right now, I'm very much into reading about China and reading about North Korea and things like that. So the next 2 on my list here, I have one, it's the Hiroshima Diary, the Journal of a Japanese Physician, August 6th to September 30th, 1945, by Michihiko Hachiya. I have read another famous book by Dr. Nagai, I believe was his name. It's been a while, but he was a physician in Nagasaki. And there's a memorial to him, and there's not a memorial, there's a museum actually in his name in Nagasaki that you can go to. And so I've read about a physician in Nagasaki, so the idea of reading about a physician in Hiroshima sounds just as fascinating and just as good. Then when it comes to North Korea, I have the title Under the Loving Care of the Fatherly Leader, North Korea and the Kim Dynasty by Bradley K. Martin. Obviously North Korea with all its secrets, it's just its sense of secrecy and a whole government being based on this one family. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that, and there's very much wonder into what will North Korea fail in our generation, or is it gonna have to be the next generation? Like, am I gonna see it in my lifetime? Like, that's what I really want to know. I really wish I could have a crystal ball to see, will North Korea fail in my lifetime? That would be fascinating. I really hope it happens. Like, that's gonna be an amazing turning point in history, and I really want that to happen. But yeah, so reading about the Kim family and the Kim dynasty just sounds like a really, really good read, and something that I just know will be super fascinating. Then I have three books, and I'm kind of torn about which one to buy, because I don't think I need to read all three. But obviously, as I mentioned before, John Krakauer's Into Thin Air, about his Mount Everest expedition, was super fascinating. And then I've also read another mountain tragedy book called Dead Mountain, about a tragedy in Russia, and like a mysterious death in the mountains in Russia back in, what was it, early 20s, early 30s. And then just recently I read a French nonfiction about the very first alpinists in Laos, China, and I thought that was really fascinating. And so I've always been fascinated by the story of the disaster in the plane crash of the sports team. I believe it was a rugby team that crashed in the Andes. And then to survive, they had to basically go through horrifying events. So there are two books in that sound interesting. There's one, it's The Miracle in the Andes, 72 Days on the Mountain and My Long Trek Home by Nando, Parrado, and Vince Rouse. And there's also Alive, The Story of the Andes Survivors by Piers Paul Reed. Now, both of these are very highly rated. It's just one of them is from a personal point of view, from someone who actually was in that situation, and the other one is kind of more of a John Krakauer kind of view, someone who's looking at the situation from the outside. So both are very valuable point of views, but I wouldn't want to buy both. So I'm just gonna have to choose one, and then if I want, I can just read the other one later. But those sound very, very good. There's another mountain story that sounded quite good. It's called Touching the Void, The True Story of One Man's Miraculous Survival by Joe Simpson. That one I don't really remember much. That's not really on my priority list. It is a book. I added it in 2021, which is probably about when I read Into Thin Air. But it was definitely a book. I believe it had quite a lot of ratings. It's fairly reputable in the mountain disaster nonfiction area of things, and it just sounded quite interesting. So that one's something I need to take into consideration. I think it's going to remain on my wish list. It's not something I don't think I'll refresh my TBR with it, but it's on my wish list, and it does still sound quite interesting. Then going back into some East Asia nonfiction, I have We Band of Angels, The Untold Story of the American Women Trapped on Bataan by Elizabeth Norman. So obviously when it comes to Japan and their horrible treatment of foreign prisoner of wars, and just like the the native population in the countries they forcibly went into, it's absolutely horrific what you read about those. So I am always looking for new perspectives on that event. When it comes to the Bataan and the Bataan Death March, the most recent book I had read was about an American prisoner of war who was in the Bataan Death March. And I think the idea of getting a female perspective, because obviously rape was a big issue, and the whole thing with comfort women and whatnot, just absolutely horrifying. So I think getting the story of the perspective of women during that time period would be an excellent read. Then I was recommended this book. It's called The People's Republic of Amnesia, which was subtitled Tiananmen Revisited. So another book about Tiananmen Square. I've read quite a bit of it, especially since I'm quite fascinated by Mao's China, and that's been a topic that I have been reading a lot about lately. So that book by Louisa was actually personally recommended to me as a book I would probably quite enjoy. So that one sounds really good. Now, from the booktuber Municorn, she once did a video about nonfiction from China, and she recommended this book, and it sounds exactly like up my alley. And it's called Rivertown, 2 Years on the Yangtze by Peter Hessler. I quite like travelogues within a country. especially for me, for Japan. Alan Booth has a definitely special heart in my book, a special place in my heart for his books where he's walking and traveling around Japan. And so the idea of taking that feeling and that mood and bringing it to China and following Peter Hessler's adventure going down the river sounds absolutely fascinating. So that one is definitely high on my priority list when it comes to replacing my TBR pile. So those are the books that are most that are highest on my priority list, I would say. I do have a sub list, which is, I call it my under consideration list, because it's something like they're titles that I've picked up here and there, but they don't have that much of a reputation, or maybe they're much harder to get because they're older. So I would have to there'd be like no new books that you can just pick up from a bookstore. I'd actually have to like find them. So I have a few of these kind of books, and also a lot of them are just like similar to topics I've already read. So the question is, do I need to really follow the exact same thing, or am I still looking for fresh new perspectives? But just to give you an idea of kind of like the type of books that are under consideration for me, I have one, it's called Fan Shen, a documentary of revolution in a Chinese village by William Hinton and Fran Magdoff. I think that one takes place in communist China, so that one sounds interesting. I have another one, it's called Curse on This Country, The Rebellious Army of Imperial Japan by Danny Orbach. That one I don't recall at all what this is about. Let's click on it and see. Imperial Japanese soldiers were notorious for blindly following orders, and their enemies in the Pacific War derided them as cattle to the slaughter. But in fact, the Japanese army had a long history as one of the most disobedient armies in the world. And it seems to follow that. So looks like a military history. I don't know. This is under consideration. Now just reading that blurb, I don't know how I feel about it. It's also only available in hardcover for $30. So it's quite a commitment to read. So yeah, this is kind of why these books are still under consideration. Another one I have is Memoirs of a Kamikaze, a World War II pilot's inspiring story of survival, honor, and reconciliation by Kazuo Odachi. I already have a book about a kamikaze, and so I don't quite know if I need to read another one, but it is on my list because the book that I do have isn't a personal account. It's about a single individual, but it's written by a foreign historian, while this book would actually be a memoir. And it is always good to like combine primary sources with like more like history, like proper history, where like everything's connected by someone else. So that's why that one's on there. It's just like having a primary source for a from a kamikaze's point of view. Then again, I have the story, so a lot of war. I have Ghost Stories, the epic account of World War II's greatest rescue mission by Hampton Sides. I have The Battle for Okinawa by Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. I have The Nanjing Massacre, a Japanese journalist confronts Japan's national shame by Katsuichi Honda. I have The Comfort Women, Japan Brutal's Regime of Enforced Prostitution in the Second World War by George Hicks. I have Japan's Colonization of Korea, Discourse and Power by Alexis Dudden. I have Brokers of Empire, Japanese Settler Colonialism in Korea by Jun Uchida. I have Accused American War Criminal by Fisky Hanley, etc., etc. I have a lot of war books. Obviously, you can see that I had a phase. There are some chew books. Again, they're not easy to find. But definitely inspired by the book, the movie. There's a movie with Glenn Close where she is part of a group of women who are prisoner of wars by the Japanese, and I believe they're in the Philippines. And it's this group of women, they basically create a choir to basically just lift the mood and give them inspiration and give them hope and try and just make their experience better. And that's based on a true story. And that's the book for that is The Song of Survival, Women in Turn by Helen Colgan. So that's a book that's always intrigued me. Similarly, there's a book called Paradise Road by Betty Jeffrey. So once again, the perspective of foreign women who were prisoners of war by the Japanese army. One more war book, The Jungle is Neutral, Soldiers' 2-Year Escape from the Japanese Armor by F. Spencer Chapman. And then finally, one more Comfort Women book, Comfort Woman, A Filipino Story of Prostitution and Slavery Under the Japanese Military by Maria Rosa Henson. So yeah, like I think you can see maybe why for my under consideration TBR wish list, there's a lot of war books because it's a heavy topic. I'm not a war historian, so it's not a topic that I would want to be immersed in every single day, all day, reading several books back to back. That sounds very exhausting, both emotionally and mentally. So for me, I think it's something that I think is a topic that will always be fascinating for me. And I think it's something like little by little, I can bring those into my life and read them without needing to like all of a sudden buy 10, 15 books about the war and then just reading that for like months on end. So yeah, those are the books on my wish list currently. Definitely feel free to recommend me any other books that you think I would like or that you're reading that you would find interesting, or let me know if there's any books from this wish list today that I've introduced where you're like, wow, yeah, that does sound interesting. So yeah, that's where we are with my TBR wish list. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.